My name is Arthur Finch and I'm 72 years old. I've lived a full life, seen my share of joy and sorrow, but nothing prepared me for the day my son Michael died, and nothing could have prepared me for what happened next, at his funeral, in the very home I built with my own hands. My daughter-in-law, Clara, stood before a room full of grieving family and friends and told me to get out. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Michael had left me a secret, a quiet act of love that would unravel her entire scheme. To understand how we got there, you need to know about the house. I bought it in 1978, a small, sturdy place on Elm Street, just outside of Portland. My wife, Eleanor, and I poured our lives into it. She chose the paint colors. I laid every brick in the patio. It was more than a house. It was the foundation of our family. We raised Michael there, watched him grow from a curious boy to a kind, thoughtful man. Eleanor passed away 5 years ago, leaving me in that house, surrounded by echoes of our life together. Michael, my only child, worried about me. So when he suggested he and his new wife, Clara, move in to help, I welcomed them with open arms. I thought it was a son's devotion, a comfort in my old age. I had no idea it was the beginning of a calculated plan, one that would only be revealed in the most painful way imaginable. Clara was 35 when she married Michael. On the surface, she was charming, always polite at family gatherings, quick with a smile. But behind closed doors, a different woman emerged. Within months, she began subtly reshaping our home. Eleanor's antique writing desk, a dark mahogany piece, with a faint scratch on its left leg from when Michael, as a boy, had tried to carve his initials, was relegated to the attic. The guest room, where I kept my fishing gear, became her meditation space. I let it all go. It was easier than arguing. Michael worked long hours as an architect, and I saw the strain on him, caught between his wife's demands and my quiet acceptance. He used to be so vibrant, so full of laughter. Now, he often seemed subdued, nodding along to Clara's pronouncements at dinner. I never spoke ill of her to him, not once, because I could see the burden he carried. But I noticed things. The way she spoke about the house as if it were already hers. The casual questions about the deed, still solely in my name. The calculating look in her eyes when she watched me. I told myself I was an old man, overly suspicious, that my son was happy, and that was what mattered. I was wrong to stay silent for so long. About 6 months before everything changed, Michael came to me. It was a Saturday morning. Clara was at a yoga retreat. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a boy, and he looked troubled. He handed me a thick manila envelope. "Dad," he said, his voice low, "keep this safe. Somewhere Clara would never think to look. If anything ever happens to me, open this first. Promise me." I remember a small laugh escaping me. "Michael, don't be dramatic. You're a healthy man." But he didn't smile. His gaze was intense, a mix of fear and resolve I'd never seen. I took the envelope, tucked it into the old metal strongbox in my closet, the one where Eleanor kept our important papers. I didn't ask more questions. I trusted my son, and he looked like a man who had already made up his mind about something serious. Looking back, I wonder how much he knew, how long he'd been quietly protecting me. That envelope sat untouched for 6 months, a ticking time bomb I knew nothing about. Then came the call, a Tuesday evening in March. Michael had been driving home from work when a distracted driver swerved into his lane. He was gone before he reached the hospital. I stood in the kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, the world tilting on its axis. Clara was beside me. For a fleeting moment I saw genuine shock, true grief on her face. It was a small comfort in the crushing darkness. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls, and an ache so profound it stole my breath. Clara handled most of it, and I was grateful, barely able to dress myself. I kept setting 3 plates at dinner, kept expecting to hear his car pull into the driveway. Losing Eleanor had been hard. Losing Michael felt like the final piece of my life, the last link to the family we'd built, had been ripped away. I sat in his old bedroom, the same one he had as a boy, and cried until I was empty. I had no idea that in less than a week, the woman helping me plan my son's funeral would stand in that very house and tell me to leave. The funeral was a cold, gray Saturday. The church was packed. friends, colleagues, neighbors who had watched Michael grow up. Clara stood beside me, a picture of a grieving widow in her black dress, accepting condolences with a solemn grace. After the burial, everyone came back to the house for the reception, a long-standing family tradition. I sat in my armchair in the living room, still in my funeral suit, watching people mill about with plates of food. Clara approached me, a plate in her hand, but she didn't offer it. She leaned down, her voice a low, chilling whisper, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Arthur," she said, her eyes devoid of warmth, "you have 30 days to pack your things and leave. This is my house now." The murmurs in the room died down. A hush fell, heavy and uncomfortable. Every single person in that living room heard her, on the day we buried my son, in the house I had built with my own hands over 40 years ago. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her in front of all those people. I looked at Clara for a long moment, and something inside me went completely still, the way water goes quiet just before it freezes solid. I thought about Michael, about the envelope in my closet, about the months I had trusted him without asking questions. I thought about 40 years of memories in that house, about Eleanor's garden and the patio I built. Then I smiled at Clara, a real, calm smile, and I said, "Understood." That's all I said, one word. The room remained silent for a few more seconds before people slowly resumed their quiet conversations, unsure of what they had just witnessed. I stood up from my armchair, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and packed one bag. I didn't need much: a few changes of clothes, my medication, a faded photo of Eleanor and Michael from a Christmas long ago, and the metal strongbox from my closet, Michael's envelope still locked inside it. I came back downstairs 20 minutes later, bag in one hand, box tucked under my other arm, and walked straight past Clara toward the front door. She looked almost disappointed, like she had expected tears or a fight. I gave her nothing. I opened the front door, stepped out into the crisp March air, and walked 2 houses down the street without looking back. Behind me, I could still hear the low murmur of confused guests inside my own house, wondering what they had just watched happen to an old man on the worst day of his life. David Peterson had been my neighbor for 25 years, ever since he and his wife, Sarah, moved in 2 doors down. He was 68, a retired carpenter, the kind of man who still helped neighbors fix leaky faucets. He had been at Michael's funeral, and he had heard exactly what Clara said in that living room. When he opened his front door and saw me standing on his porch with a bag and a metal box, he didn't ask a single question. He just stepped aside and said, "Come in, Arthur. It's cold out here." Sarah made up their guest bedroom for me that same night without being asked. I sat at their kitchen table, and David poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across to me before sitting down. "Want to talk about it?" he asked. I told him everything. The 30-day deadline, the way she said it in front of everyone, the almost triumphant look on her face. David shook his head slowly, his jaw tight with anger on my behalf. "That house is yours, Arthur," he said. "The deed's in your name. Always has been. She's got no legal right to put you out." I nodded. But my mind was on that envelope, still locked in the box beside my chair, the one Michael had told me to open first. That night, after David and Sarah had gone to bed, I sat alone at their kitchen table under a small lamp, and I finally opened it. Inside the envelope were 3 things that changed everything. The first was a copy of the deed to my house, confirming what David had said. The house had always been in my name alone, never transferred to Michael or Clara. The second was a life insurance policy Michael had taken out through his work 5 years earlier, worth $750,000. 3 months before he died, Michael had quietly changed the beneficiary on that policy from Clara to me. The third item was a handwritten letter in Michael's own familiar script. In it, he explained that he had discovered Clara was secretly draining their joint savings account and had run up over $80,000 in hidden credit card debt she never told him about. He wrote that he suspected she was planning to push me out of the house eventually so she could sell it, and that he had been quietly preparing to file for divorce once he had enough proof. He asked me to forgive him for not telling me sooner, and he asked me to protect myself no matter what happened, no matter how things looked on the surface. I sat at that kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, not just from grief now, but from something else too. A kind of fierce clarity settling into my chest. My son had seen this coming. My son had spent his last months quietly protecting his father from a woman who had already decided our family's grief was nothing more than an opportunity. I folded the letter carefully, placed everything back in the box, and for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel powerless anymore. The next morning, while I was still at David's house eating breakfast, Clara was already moving fast. A neighbor across the street, an older woman named Martha who had lived on Elm Street even longer than I had, called David's phone around 9 a.m. She said she had seen a moving truck and a real estate agent's car parked in my driveway. The agent, a woman named Brenda Hayes, had put a small sign near the mailbox that read, "Coming soon," with a photo of the house on it. Clara was moving to sell my house less than 24 hours after burying her husband, and less than a day after telling me to leave. What she didn't know was that Michael's letter had told me exactly where to look and what to look for. That same morning, I called Richard Vance, an old family friend who had been a real estate attorney in Portland for decades. I told him everything, from Clara's ultimatum to Michael's secret envelope. Richard listened patiently, then asked me to bring him the contents of the strongbox immediately. Within an hour, I was in his office, laying out the deed, the insurance policy, and Michael's letter. Richard's expression grew grim as he read Michael's words. "Arthur," he said, "this is a clear case of attempted fraud. Michael's letter is crucial." Richard immediately contacted Detective Miller at the Portland Police Department, a sharp, no-nonsense officer known for her thoroughness. He also called the life insurance company, informing them of the fraudulent claim Clara was undoubtedly preparing to file. Detective Miller took my statement and examined Michael's letter and the deed. She then paid a visit to Brenda Hayes, the real estate agent, who, completely unaware of the fraudulent ownership claim, immediately pulled the "Coming Soon" sign from my yard and canceled the listing paperwork. Detective Miller told Richard that with Michael's handwritten letter, the confirmed deed in my name, and the attempted insurance fraud, she had more than enough for a warrant. She also confirmed that Clara had indeed attempted to file an early claim with Michael's life insurance company, listing herself as the beneficiary, not realizing the policy had already been legally changed 3 months earlier. That attempt alone raised additional red flags with the insurance company's fraud department, who had already begun their own internal review before the police even got involved. Everything Clara had rushed to do in the days after burying her husband was now working directly against her, one piece of evidence at a time, exactly the way Michael had quietly planned for it to happen if she ever tried something like this. The next morning, exactly as Detective Miller had planned, a Portland police cruiser pulled into the driveway of my house on Elm Street at 7:40 a.m. Martha, the neighbor across the street, told David later that Clara answered the door still in her bathrobe, confused and half asleep. Detective Miller identified herself and informed Clara she was investigating a filed complaint of deed fraud and attempted insurance fraud related to the property. According to Martha, Clara's face went white as a sheet standing in that doorway. She tried explaining that Michael had signed paperwork transferring the house to her before he passed, but Detective Miller calmly informed her that no such legal transfer had ever occurred, and that the deed remained solely in my name. Clara was brought in for formal questioning that same day. Within a week, Clara was formally charged with attempted deed fraud and attempted insurance fraud. The forged deed she had apparently been planning to file was never even submitted, but the intent was clear. She was given 10 days to vacate the property, the same house she had given me only 30 days to leave less than 2 weeks earlier. David told me later that when the moving truck finally came for her, only one neighbor came out to watch, and it wasn't out of kindness. It was Martha, making sure Clara didn't try to take anything that didn't belong to her. I moved back into my house on Elm Street on a quiet Thursday afternoon in April, almost exactly 1 month after I'd walked out with one bag and a metal box under my arm. David and Sarah helped me carry a few boxes back in, and Martha brought over a homemade apple pie that evening, the same kind of small, quiet kindness this street had always been known for. The house felt different without Michael in it, and it always will, but it also felt like mine again, fully and completely, the way it was supposed to feel. I found Eleanor's antique writing desk, still packed away in the attic where Clara had relegated it, and I set it back up in the living room where it belonged. Clara eventually took a plea deal on the fraud charges, avoiding the maximum sentence, but still receiving probation, a permanent criminal record, and a court order to repay legal fees related to her false claims. She never contacted me again, not once, and I never reached out to her either. Some nights I still sit in my armchair in the living room, the same chair I was sitting in the day she told me to pack my bags in front of 30 grieving guests, and I think about my son. I think about how, even in his final months, even while carrying his own quiet fears, Michael found a way to protect his father one last time. That envelope in my closet wasn't just paperwork. It was my son's final act of love for me, delivered months before he even knew it would be needed. I lost my son, and nothing will ever replace that, but I got to keep the house we built our family in, and more importantly, I got to keep the truth of who my son really was, right until the very end. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real people, events, or places is purely coincidental.